In 2006, Clover Studio released Okami. It was a critical success, but a commercial failure. Later that year, Clover Studio was shut down. Hideki Kamiya, the director of Okami, and a lot of the developers from Clover ended up at a new studio called Platinum Games, who would then go on to make some of the greatest action games ever made, like Bayonetta, Vanquish, and Metal Gear Rising. And back in the day, Kamiya himself directed Resident Evil 2 and the original Devil May Cry. Point is, these folks know how to make good games, really good ones. Any utterance of Okami in modern times is likely followed by some statement of nostalgia or praise, but like most people, I had never actually played it. Many call it a masterpiece, or at the very least, one of the greatest games of all time, and now after having rolled credits on Okami, I understand why people say that, and I also think I understand why it really didn't make any money. Let's start at the beginning. Chief among the game's criticisms is the pacing, which does apply to the game generally, but more specifically it applies to the introduction. It'll take you 15 minutes before you even get to move. In that time, you'll be watching the intro cutscenes, which not only lay out the inciting incident for the game, but also another different but related story about a wolf named Shiranui, who just coincidentally looks like the protagonist, saving a village from the evil demon Orochi 100 years ago. All of this will seem somewhat reasonable in hindsight if you've completed the game, but most people don't get that far, because immediately asking someone to sit through 15 minutes straight of dialogue is generally not really a good idea. Moving the history lesson to some point after completing the first dungeon, for example, would have probably been the better move. The intro tries to set the tone for the rest of the game, but the game opens with a serious retelling of how Shiranui, aka Amaterasu, aka you, tragically sacrificed themselves to defeat Orochi with the help of the Chosen One. In the very next scene, 100 years later, some idiot pulls the sword out that kept Orochi sealed away, and the world is shrouded in darkness. It is the literal apocalypse, and the nature goddess Sakuya uses all of her remaining power to protect this one village and resurrect Amaterasu, aka Shiranui, aka you. So far, this is all pretty serious and rather grim. And then suddenly, a little guy named Isun jumps out of Sakuya's cleavage and immediately starts cracking jokes. It is complete tonal whiplash. It's not a bad thing, per se, but I think it's telling that even close to 20 years later, when I tell people who are only kind of distantly familiar with Okami that it has peach-shaped ass windows and dirty jokes in the first 15 minutes, they're surprised, and so was I. If you're anything like me and never played Okami and were only aware of it kind of distantly, you might have thought that it was a serious, sort of pretentious, artistic 3D platformer about restoring nature. And that's not really true. It's kind of true, but it's not really true. The game proves to be good at hiding its true character and therefore its true value, even close to 2 decades later. The comparison that most people reach for first is the older Zelda games, and it's pretty easy to see why. There's a quippy, tiny sidekick who gives you direction. The game is a semi-open world with strong guidance to your next objective. You break pots to get money and items. It even does that weird Zelda thing where certain keywords are colored differently to make them stand out. Naturally, though, there's also dungeons that are themed around and make you solve puzzles with a specific ability. The puzzles themselves are usually extremely easy, with your companion Isun and the game's own camera doing absolutely everything they can to make sure that you already know what to do before you're even given control. Damn, I wonder what I'm supposed to do. I really wonder. What could I possibly be meant to do? Just like Zelda, it's not a hard game, and that does make it very accessible, and that makes it even more curious that it's sold so poorly, but put a pin in that for now. Focusing more on the gameplay side, once you watch the opening movie, you'll be struck with how original and interesting the celestial brush mechanic is. At almost any time, you can stop time and draw on the screen. Drawing a horizontal line does a slash, drawing a circle causes plants to blossom, and drawing a bomb creates a bomb. Drawing a spiral or loop causes wind to blow in the direction you drew. Why? Why didn't that work? Why? Dude, the controller is vibrating as if the fucking thing is gonna work, and then it just doesn't work. What? It's not always working reliably, but it's pretty functional and it's really novel even today. And it's a lot of fun to think about all the potential this kind of mechanic has. Naturally, you start with none of these powers, but the game does rapidly dole them out to you in a way that is genuinely very fun and very rewarding. Depending on how much optional content you decide to do, and how fast you do it, a playthrough will likely take you anywhere from 30 to 50 hours. The first 15 or so are constantly giving you new abilities that are meaningfully different from each other and often have interesting and unique applications to the open world, puzzles, and combat. For a while. You're going to be playing the majority of the game with most of the interesting brush techniques already unlocked. There are more brush techniques beyond those given early on, but the game dramatically slows down their acquisition and their applications become less general and more specific, and the ones it does give you at this point are often just dragging an element from one thing to another. Water, fire, lightning, and ice versions of element dragging are all functionally the same, but each one is a separate power with hours of gameplay between them. The element dragging is occasionally used in combat, but they don't meaningfully change how you engage with it. They aren't so much an expansion of your kit in the creative sense as they are just 4 flavors of the same key for the same kind of game design lock. The game ends up stretching itself a little too thin with the Celestial Brush. It establishes a lot of interesting mechanics early on, but since the puzzles are so easy, they don't meaningfully challenge you to use them in creative ways, and there's not enough of them to rely on the excitement of their acquisition either. Many of the later brush techniques are actually just limited to making combat even easier than it already is. Combat is, in a word, rote. That is to say, predictable, repetitive, and routine. There is one combo. You press X, and then you press it again, and then you press it again. You can equip 2 weapons, a main and a sub-weapon. The main weapon is what you primarily attack with. It's the one that gets the mashing X combo. The sub-weapon will give you 1 additional move that you can use, which does not really flow well into or from the main weapon combo, and you can't switch weapons on the fly either. If you could switch your main and sub-weapons between each other, that would have been a welcome little morsel of gameplay depth, and that's not even really a crazy ask either, since that's basic functionality for an action game. Devil May Cry 3, also published by Capcom, came out a year before Okami, and sure enough, it has mid-combo weapon switching. Platinum Games were, and debatably still are, the kings of this kind of character action or spectacle fighter combat, and that studio is, remember, largely Clover's legacy. But it's hard to tell that from playing Okami. The depth in the combat doesn't come from the character action component, it really just comes from the Celestial Brush. And it's not exactly deep. Every enemy has specific interactions with particular brush techniques. Some will block your attack, so you have to use the brush to slash through it. Some will block your attacks with an umbrella, so you have to blow it away. That's mostly it as far as what's required for combat. With very few exceptions, combat is really just lock and key design that kind of demands you do the pre-programmed correct ability for the enemy. There is another layer to the combat prescriptivism where every enemy corresponds to a specific ability that will cause them to drop demon fangs if you hit them with it during their slow motion death animation. If you couldn't follow that, I don't blame you, it's a little weird and specific. Demon fangs are a special currency that is actually genuinely scarce and actually genuinely useful for buying powerful items, unlike the regular money and unlike praise, of which you will basically always have way more of than you know what to do with. The irony is, the most fun part of the combat is usually just trying to figure out for every given enemy which ability the game wants you to use to get those demon fangs. The game is very particular about the way you have to do it also. Killing an enemy with a brush technique means you can't get demon fangs, even if it is the right technique for that enemy. So you have to make sure that the hit that takes their health bar to 0 is a regular weapon attack, and then you're allowed to do the brush technique. Killing an enemy is basically just following a recipe. The combat is actually so easy that I never died not even once in my entire playthrough. And that's not because I'm a gamer god, it's because Okami's only difficulty option is padded in childproof. Literally, it's pretty good if you want to get your kid into video games. More difficulty options really would have been great, because there's no joy in winning when losing was never a possibility. You have tons of health, a regenerating overshield that can prevent up to 3 hits of damage, and if all else fails, up to 4 revives with the astral pouch. And that's without using any consumables, which the game will just shower you with constantly. Even if you've never played a video game before, you're likely never going to die in this game. Accessible? Absolutely. That's great. But the one size does not fit all here. If you're a relatively lower skill player, you're probably going to have a pretty good experience. Combat is going to be a little tense and it's not going to be too punishing. For the rest of us though, the game offers 0 resistance, so combat doesn't offer any satisfaction. The irony is, that opening cutscene kind of feels like a chore for a lot of people because they're eager to get to the gameplay. But after just a few hours, I felt like I was slogging through the gameplay just to see the next cutscene. I'm wishy-washy on like whether or not this game is actually good. And part of that slog comes from the game's weird staggered nature that just constantly takes control away from you. Once you start a fight, an arena will appear around you. You'll probably kill everything in a matter of seconds, like we talked about, and then you'll just have to sit there and wait for the score screen to pop up and the walls to come down. This takes several seconds, so a frankly massive percentage of your time spent doing combat encounters is just the waiting part. And it's not just the combat encounters either. Every chest you open leads to a dialogue box that pauses the game and scrolls through text that you've probably already read, and it lasts approximately, by my count, 4 years every single time. These chests are everywhere and only seconds of gameplay apart from each other. Zelda usually has the good sense to not show the dialogue box again if you've already seen it before, and Clover clearly knew how annoying this was on some level because the various food items do actually behave this way. But unfortunately, all the treasures and collectibles don't. To add insult to injury, these chests are almost always just treasures that you sell for money that, remember, you don't need, and occasionally they're one of the prayer beads that actually do literally nothing until you have collected all 100 of them, which literally cannot happen until you've already beaten the game. What's the reward for doing so? It's a stronger weapon, as if combat needed to be easier. There's also all the animals to feed. Each group of animals in the world is its own kind of collectible. Pressing B to feed them will open up your item menu, and you have to select one of 4 feed types depending on what is appropriate for the given animal. Honestly, it's cute, maybe the first couple times, but it is genuinely insane to me that they play this 40-second long cutscene every single time. Mercifully, it is skippable. But either way, you have to go through the skipping animation and you have to stand and wait until the praise flows into your body. Praise is basically XP that you spend on character stat increases. None of them really matter because they're all just making combat easier, except for the money and the incapacity upgrades, because those actually let you use the Celestial Brush more often without being forced to wait for it to recharge. This isn't really gameplay to me, it's more like an interruption. In isolation, it's just a few seconds of waiting, you might say. Who cares? But with each interruption only a few seconds apart from each other, it really does take the wind out of the game's sails, and it's hard to argue that a version of the game with fewer of these interruptions and more smooth transitions would be a worse one. All the kinetic energy in the game is just stop dead every single time you get into a fight, collect something, or feed an animal, which sucks because that's basically everything there is to do. There are a few optional encounters that essentially act like minigames, and they're actually pretty fun for the little distractions that they are, but they're in the minority, and their reward is just praise, which, as we established, is not quite pointless, but, as Dan Olsen might say, very low on point. All this together means exploring lacks intrinsic motivation because it's not enjoyable to open a million chests and sit through repetitive dialogue boxes and to skip through feeding rituals all the time. and it lacks extrinsic motivation because almost nothing that you'll find doing those things will change anything about what you can do or how you will play, because all the game can think to reward you with is money or praise, neither of which are ever in short supply, nor would you need them even if they were. That 30 to 50 hour figure I quoted you earlier isn't really representative of just how long the game feels like it is. And part of that comes from the aforementioned gameplay interruptions, but that isn't even the whole picture. The game is structured into 3 parts, each one mostly acting as an independent narrative with its own satisfactory finale. Most people talk about how shocked they were that this game just kind of keeps going after it feels like it would have ended. Narratively, you reach what is a pretty satisfying conclusion, and the game just refuses to roll credits, and it does that twice. There's the first act, which is all about Kamiki Village and defeating Orochi, but the village and its characters are given a lot of screen time and they feel like they're too important to leave behind, but that's pretty much exactly what you do. You largely don't see these people again until the ending. Their story is pretty much over, but yours is only beginning. There is another 2 whole thirds of the game that are just as long and honestly not always as good. The problem is, after about halfway through, the game has shown you its whole hand in terms of gameplay. You repeat the same mini-games, the new brush abilities start just being different flavors of that same element dragging, you start fighting enemies that are suspiciously similar to the ones that you've already fought. Gameplay-wise, nothing else at this point is going to surprise you. But on the bright side, at that point, you're likely pretty invested in the narrative, so it kind of just ends up that the gameplay becomes that thing that you tolerate between cutscenes. The story is what keeps you playing. The darkness is pushed away by awakening sacred trees, nature is framed as the rightful status quo, monsters and evil can corrupt for a time, but flowers and trees are forever. The game features nature, but it's not really about nature. Amaterasu creates flowers everywhere they step, and you draw circles to make trees blossom, but honestly, restoring nature is, at best, an instrumental goal to defeating the forces of evil. It's not really the primary goal itself. At worst, it's a happy accident and a pretty distraction. Speaking of, let's talk about the game's visuals for a little bit. The art style is obviously iconic, and it looks nice in stills. I'm not going to say otherwise. But in motion, it is blurry, ghosty, and locked at 30 FPS, even on PC. For a modern audience used to higher performance and motion clarity, Okami can be genuinely difficult to get through. It took me about 20 hours before my eyes adjusted enough to be able to play it for more than a couple hours at a time. And there's a tremendous irony in a game being this pretty, but also this hard to look at for more than a couple hours. The game is nearly old enough to drink, so I'm giving the original a bit of a pass here. But the HD re-releases that we got are frankly just not good enough. It's not 2006 anymore. We don't have low-resolution CRTs with perfect motion clarity to hide your crimes. This isn't even what Okami really looked like. These ports are doing a terrible job at realizing the game's graphical potential, and the experience today doesn't really hold a candle to how good this game would have looked back when it originally released, despite the extreme stylization, which under normal circumstances tends to make games age much more gracefully than it does here. Okay, so I promise I'm done saying bad things about the game. Let's talk about what it does really well. So, your goal as Amaterasu, God of the Sun and Origin of all life, is to defeat the evil bad guys and make it back to heaven. The plot, that is to say, the major events of the game that move the narrative along, is pretty typical for this kind of story. You've probably seen things like it before. But where Okami really shines is in its writing. It effortlessly jumps back and forth between irreverent comedy and affecting sincerity. One scene is going to have Isun talking about busty babes, and in the next, you're going to be avenging the unceremonious death of that same busty babe. The tonal whiplash from the intro is largely just how the game is, and once you're on the same page, it's pretty charming in its own way. Is the joke gonna be like, oh, she's hot? Yeah, who would have thought? and it somehow manages to hit every emotional note that it tries to play. Outside of the visual presentation, which is good but complicated for the reasons that we've mentioned, the writing is the only aspect of the game that is consistently strong throughout the entire 30-hour runtime. The game has heart. Amaterasu never says a word, but they're characterized through body language better than most modern AAA games could do with hundreds of lines of dialogue and fucking mocap suits. And they're a fucking dog. They're brave, loyal, compassionate, and an excellent judge of character while also being pretty easily distracted and prone to boredom. Isun, your obligatory small companion, is infamously girl crazy and generally pretty rude, but he's more like the rogue with a heart of gold. He says he's going on this adventure for selfish reasons, just to learn all the celestial brush techniques to further his own personal career as an artist, and maybe he believes that at first, but ultimately, he ends up using his abilities to create a work of art so moving that it causes everyone to pray for and believe in Amaterasu during the final battle. A god's power comes from people's belief, and his advertising campaign is enough to give you the power-up that you need to finally defeat the big bad. It's pretty tropey, but it is done so well that I understand why people like to call this a masterpiece. There is just so much buildup and characterization, and it feels like you went on this massive journey, and especially in the last third or so, the game starts cashing every narrative check that it wrote along the way. And in the end, it sticks the landing so well, it's really easy to forget the lesser parts of the experience. There's a pair of psychology terms that I tend to think about a lot, and it's primacy and recency bias. Basically, people are better able to recall beginnings and endings. When Okami is discussed, it's almost always in the context of these two moments. People remember the slow and frustrating beginning and the emotionally resonant ending. It takes tremendous effort to look beyond the incredible ending and think critically about the experience that you had in the middle during the bulk of the game. And it turns out that is where Okami is weakest. It may or may not surprise you to hear that Okami had a troubled development. The game ends with an obvious cliffhanger saying that the adventure is only beginning, and sure enough, Kamiya has said in interviews that they only finished about half of what they originally wanted. The original plan was likely that half the game would take place on Earth, the whole game that we got, and the other half would take place up in heaven in the celestial plane. Kamiya is actually on record blaming low enthusiasm from the team for a lot of the development woes of Okami, and he's also on record just telling the development team at the post-release party that they just sucked, which is pretty funny and very much like him. He says that they also allowed just way too many different ideas from the team, leading the game to be a sort of incoherent mess. He says at one point it was more like a simulation with realistic graphics. Turns out that the main motivation for having the more artistic brushwork style was just because the realistic style was running too poorly on the PS2. And the celestial brush mechanic, arguably the most iconic and original part of the finished game, wasn't even part of the original plan. It spawned directly from the new art direction, because they're like, well, if the game looks so painterly, wouldn't it be cool if the player could paint? It's honestly a miracle the game came out at all, and I don't really think that's as obvious here as it usually is for cases like this. Okami's art, music, and writing are timeless in a way that few games can replicate. Some really talented people worked really hard to make this something special. So why didn't it sell? Well, it's important to think about the gaming landscape at the time in which the game was released. Okami was an unashamedly Japanese PS2 game releasing in 2006. The 360 was already out at this point, and gaming trends were moving more towards more dark and mature aesthetics. This is the same year we got Twilight Princess, Zelda itself going more dark and gritty, Gears of War, Persona 3, Splinter Cell Double Agent, Bully, Dead Rising, the list goes on. All of these games are kinda edgy, if not the edgiest one in their series. And Okami, on the other hand, is this playful Japanese fantasy Zelda-like game on last generation hardware. The mid-2000s were not the time for this kind of game, and the PS2 wasn't the system for it either. I have my criticisms of the gameplay, but even with all of that in mind, I don't think the game deserved its poor performance and relative obscurity. I really think it's just a victim of circumstance. The Okami we carry with us in our memory is going to be more a snapshot of how it ultimately made us feel, not of the general experience it gave us along the way. Is it illegitimate to love Okami and forgive its flaws because it was pretty and it made us feel something? No, I'm not saying that, of course not. At the same time though, it's pretty hard for me to ignore those flaws. In the year of our Lord 2025, it is difficult for me to recommend it to anyone but the most patient of players. Is it a masterpiece? I don't really think so, neither does Kamiya for that matter. But it kind of ended up feeling like one, it's written like one, it has the shape of one. Kamiya left Platinum Games in 2023 and opened a new studio named Clovers. At time of recording, they're working on Okami 2. I really hope this time Kamiya gets to finish the game. Only time will tell. Thank you for watching.